A lot of news today to analyse, so let's bring in one of the best. The Australian's Foreign Affairs editor, Greg Sheridan, joins me now from Melbourne. Thank you very much for your time, Greg. I want to start with the PM's pretty significant address today to the US Strategic Forum, the Aspen Security Forum, regarding China. Here's what he had to say about the US's relationship with China.
China and the United States have a special responsibility to uphold what Bull described as the common set of rules that build an international society. Now, that means respecting international law and the peaceful resolution of disputes, including trade disputes. It means a commitment to rules-based economic interaction. Neither coercion nor abdication from the international system is the way forward.
What did you make of his comments, Greg?
Well, look, Peter, let me just preface it by saying this situation in Plague City here in Melbourne, this is surely the worst and most incompetent state government we've ever seen in Australia. Andrews emotes well, but he cannot make the trains run, much less make them run on time. So I apologise for that. I thought Morrison gave a very strong speech to the Aspen Institute. Actually, generally, he didn't name China by name, but every single new problem that he listed us as facing, increased maritime coercion, increased territorial coercion, increased interference in democracies by non-democracies in their political systems, increased disinformation campaigns, increased cyber theft, military build-ups, radical military build-ups. Every single one of them came back squarely to China. And Morrison is telling the Australian nation that we have a lot of trouble ahead here. He's not predicting a conflict with China, but we are in a very difficult and increasingly difficult strategic situation.
I want to get your take on some comments more broadly about how the government, the Prime Minister, is handling the China relationship. Let's have a listen.
Yes, it has been very interesting to watch the change in language and the government adopting a posture of overt public criticism.
I'd say about the Prime Minister, you know, leadership is more than a Zoom chat and leadership is more than giving speeches. If he's serious about showing leadership in the region, then he has to actually deliver more than words. There's been an absence of leadership from the Prime Minister, from Mr Morrison and from this government when it comes to the region. We've seen reductions in development assistance to the region. We've seen cuts to assistance to Papua New Guinea. We've seen cuts to health assistance to Indonesia, something that was extremely short-sighted. We see an absence of leadership on economic recovery, something which is so important, particularly to Indonesia, but to the countries of Southeast Asia. And we see an absence of leadership on climate change.
Well, are they fair comments from the sidelines here or unfair, do you think, Greg?
Well, look, I really wouldn't make any criticism of Penny Wong. That's what an opposition is supposed to do. It's meant to criticise a government. I'm a bit surprised by Julie Bishop's comments because she herself was pretty tough in her language about the Chinese. I mean, she made a speech about how China could never be a regional leader because it wasn't a democracy. The government is in a very difficult position because China keeps doing things which infringe on and hurt Australia's national interests. And Australia has to respond to this, and it has to tell the Australian people what it's doing and why. At the same time, we've allowed ourselves to get into this terrible position where we are hugely dependent on China in our trade and always susceptible to trade retaliation by China. You know, the classic example, we needed to diversify with India, but we subjected the first big Indian investment, Adani, to a decade-long water torture, making it impossible for us to develop the kind of resources trade with India, which might have diversified us away from China. So I've got no great criticism of the government at all, especially Morrison. I do think his foreign minister and defence minister ought to just talk to us a bit more so that they're talking the nation through these issues so that not everything is left to the Prime Minister to do it, because also there is a greater geostrategic weight when the Prime Minister speaks than when his ministers speak.
Yeah, and you want to use him sparingly so that when he does speak, he's got the megaphone, obviously, of the office, so it has a different import than the ministers being out there. I mean, you've got to sort of strike a balance between the Julie Bishops on one side and almost, no speaks by Maurice Payne, somewhere in the middle, somewhere nicely in the middle would be about right. I want to ask you about this blast in Lebanon overnight in Beirut. We know an Australian's been killed, at least 78. I suspect, looking at that blast, it was extraordinary. There'll be more than 78 killed, sadly. Authorities are saying it all relates to highly explosive materials stored near this warehouse. US President Donald Trump, though, fronted the media pretty early on with claims of an attack.
Based on the explosion, I've met with some of our great generals, and they just seem to feel that this was not some kind of a manufacturing explosion type of event. This was seems to be, according to them, they would know better than I would, but they seem to think it was a attack. It was a bomb of some kind.
I did know, it's such a tinderbox, that region. The Israelis were out pretty quickly to say it was nothing to do with them. What do you make of President Trump's comments, and what more do we know tonight? And then what's your sense of the veracity of the reports as well?
So, Peter, this is a terrible tragedy for a nation that many Australians love very deeply. Lebanon, in many ways, the cradle of civilization. So many Lebanese Australians with family back in Lebanon. Anyone who tells you they know for sure the nature of this explosion is talking rubbish. But I'm not persuaded by President Trump's comments. No one has claimed responsibility for this bombing. It doesn't make any sense, this bombing, in any sort of strategic purpose. Look, it might turn out to be an attack, but Trump is just so undisciplined and so wild in everything he says. He misinterprets his advice, or a general might have said, look, this could well be an attack, and he's jumped out so fast. I mean, look, the fact that he said it doesn't prove it's not true, but I'm not convinced. I mean, there were huge amounts of ammonium nitrate stored very dangerously in a port for 6 years. It's not as if anybody moved it there 10 minutes ago to cause an explosion. It looks pretty just like a terrible tragedy at this stage. It might turn out to be something even worse, but just as a terrible tragedy, it's bad enough.
Yeah, and look, they're going through so much. We know that there's a trial in The Hague. We should have a result by that at the end of the week in relation to the assassination of Harari. There's obviously, the financial consequences. They've got COVID risks as well. It's a tough time for Lebanon. You mentioned President Trump there. Very interesting interview overnight. Australian journalist, long based in the US, Jonathan Swan, had this sort of exchange with the president.
Well, right here, the United States is lowest in numerous categories. We're lower than the world.
Lower than the world?
Lower than
what is that?
Europe.
In what?
Look.
In what?
Take a look. Right here. Here's case death.
Oh, you're doing death as a proportion of cases. I'm talking about death as a proportion of population. That's where the US is really bad.
Well,
much worse than South Korea, Germany, etc.
You can't do that. You have
Why
to go,
can't I do that?
You have to go by where. Look, here is the United States. You have to go by the cases. The cases.
Why not as a proportion of population?
When we have somebody, what it says is when you have somebody that has where there's a case.
Oh, okay.
The people that live from those cases.
It's surely a relevant statistic to say if the US has X population and X percentage of death of that population versus South Korea.
No, because you have to go by the cases.
Now, what struck me there, Greg, is so rarely do you see an interview where the journalist actually listens to the question, the response from the politician and frames the responding question based on what they say. Too often it seems, you listen to these interviews, it's a whole set of prepared questions and there's no actual toing and froing like you would in a parliamentary debate, let's say. I thought that, to me, was the most fascinating aspect there.
Look, I think you're right, Peter. The most deadly skill any interviewer can have is actually to listen to their subject. And, with the exception of magnificent programs like yours, that doesn't always happen that much. Where we cut that interview off, the next 10 or 15 seconds are screamingly hilarious because the guy quotes the death rate in South Korea, which is minuscule. And then Trump says, well, how do you know that's true? You can't believe that. And then the interviewer says, so you think South Korea is lying? And Trump says, oh, well, look, I wouldn't, I've got a very good relationship with South Korea, but you don't know that those statistics are true. And, I'm someone who's tried to take a balanced view of Trump. Trump has done a lot of good things. He's increased the defence expenditure, he's cut taxes, he's deregulated business, he got the economy in a great position before the virus came. But he says and does, frankly, the weirdest, strangest things. So he refuses to answer the question about deaths per million, in which the United States is pretty bad. But even in his preferred statistic, deaths per COVID case recorded, the United States is about the middle of the pack. There's no way that you could say that it is the lowest. And of course, cases depends on how much testing you do. Trump has a point there. A country like Hungary does almost no testing, so it has very few recorded cases. But this is just a bizarre, crazy way for a political leader to mangle his information. I mean, I dare say, Peter, if a politician you worked for did that, you'd have stern words with them afterwards. But just Trump lives in a different universe.
I think we're seeing the prism of the pressure in the campaign. He believed in himself last time round, but there wasn't such a strong expectation that he would get there. This time round, he's in the hot seat. He doesn't want to lose it. He wants to beat Biden, and he's not someone who's had years and years as a politician on the campaign trail. I've seen people in campaigns, people who've had pressure in business, really find it difficult, and seasoned politicians survive. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes in the next couple of months.